Greetings. Welcome to this chat about inclusive education. In these sessions, we share perspectives with some guests who join us who have experience with inclusive education across Canada. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm joined by co-host Diane Richler, who's the chair of Inclusion International's initiative Catalyst on Inclusive Education that supports global efforts to promote inclusion. Diane's also a past executive director. Executive vice president was actually her title of Inclusion Canada. And our other co-host is Jackie Speck, who's the director of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education at Western University in London, Ontario. And Jackie's also a professor of education at Western. So the three of us today have two guests. First, Bluesette Campbell, who's from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. And she lives on a ranch with her husband and two sons. Yeah, and an extended family of whom I've met because I was up there a few years ago and met with most of them. And Bluesette is a vice president of Inclusion Saskatchewan and a board member with Inclusion Canada. But more specifically, she's been active in her community in working to support inclusion for her son and to promote inclusion in local schools in that region of Saskatchewan. And our other guest today is also a parent, Anna McQuarrie. And Anna lives in Halifax. She's got a long history of working for the community living movement. She started with CACL back in the early 2000s. And she's worked for not only CACL, but also Inclusion International, and has done other things around human rights and disability rights. And more recently, she's an adoptive mother of three youngsters who have challenges in schooling, and Anna's had quite a bit of experience working to try to facilitate good education and, as much as possible, inclusive education for her three kids. And we're happy both of them have joined us today. We're going to try to explore the parent perspective on some of the issues relating to inclusion. So let's start with each of you just telling us briefly how it is that you believe that inclusion in education is or has been a vital aspect of your child's development and progress in life. Let's start with you, Bluesette.
Yes, thank you, Gordon. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I fully believe that inclusive education is vital in the success of all children, as I see the classroom as a microscopic version of community. And so if you don't have it in the classroom, how we expect as a society for inclusion just to magically happen after a student graduates would be preposterous. So it's essential that we create as much as possible the community that we see a vision for in society within the classroom of the schools. So I believe it's essential. Vital is a very strong word, but again, it can't just magically happen after a student graduates.
Anna?
Yeah, I mean, to echo Bluesette's comments, thank you for having me here. And just to agree completely, I think it is one of those things, and it's not just vital and fundamental to creating inclusive communities, it's also really vital and fundamental for families. I think one of the really big things that we've struggled with as a family is, as inclusive education has been, or even just access to education has been unreliable for us, it has required me to step away from the labor market so that I can be home full time. I had to pick my youngest up from school today at 9:46. So I think for a lot of families that access to school on a day-to-day basis is also really important for us as a family unit.
Okay, let's just let's hear a little more from each of you. This sort of takes what you've said a little further. So Bluesette, your son, it's Andrew, right?
Mhm.
Andrew had the disability of what kind of, can you tell us what your challenges were to have Andrew included in your local schools? And would I be right in surmising that given that you live in a rural part of Canada, that there is one local school available? Like there aren't like 4 schools within 10 minutes from your home.
That's correct. And that comes with its advantages and disadvantages. So so we live 4 miles south of a hamlet, which has a population of 150 people. And it does have a school, and that school has been in operation for quite some time. It is the same school that my husband went to as a child. And it has since closed down, unfortunately, because it was a fantastic school. So Andrew's experience was that he began in early entrance, sort of kind of as a surprise to us that he would qualify to attend school at the age of 4. Seemed pretty scary because he couldn't even take the first step into the bus at that point. But he did attend in hopes of getting like a routine set and sort of socialization for a couple of hours a day. And what happened with Andrew was he was hyperlexic. So at that stage, he picked up everything in the curriculum quite quickly. And where we had imagined him to stay a couple of years at least, the school recommended that he continue. So he started school very young because he was handling the curriculum. So some of the challenges that we faced with him were that he was younger developmentally and biologically, and yet sort of bored with the curriculum at those early stages as he was picking it up very quickly. So pretty soon, his peers developed much quicker than he did, and his development kind of slowed down or plateaued, and they exceeded his. So some of the challenges really began around grades 3 and 4. Our advocacy as a family really began quite early because we had early, like the ESIP program, early childhood intervention program, was actively involved since his birth. And so we always had somebody there saying, and it happened to be a parent with lots of experience, always present at those school meetings saying, hey, this is what I know to be true, and this is what I think is best for this child. And I just latched on to that individual and allowed them to lead during those really difficult times. And it worked to our advantage for sure. So having good people in your life is also essential to creating, a positive experience. So he went to a very small school, population of around 50 students until grade 8, and then transitioned to a much larger community, and which was scary, but also lucrative for the most part.
Anna, what about your experience?
Ours has been a little bit different. So for us, and part of it's our family experience as well. So our family came together through adoption, and we have 3 children. All 3 of them have disabilities, and all 3 of them came at the same time. So we sort of jumped in a little bit quickly. We didn't have a lot of pre-existing experience with the school. We just kind of showed up, basically. And I think for me, given my long-standing career, my work with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the alternative was just never, I never thought that was going to be an option or even a consideration. And so our expectation from day one is this is a fundamental human rights issue, and inclusion is the right of our kids. And so our kiddos, labels aside, neither here nor there on a lot of stuff, but one of the things that are really challenging for them is that they continue, when they're frustrated or don't understand something, to use their behavior as a way of communicating that. And so I think that schools have been particularly challenged by children that can be seen as disruptive, dysregulated, and at times to be very physical in their expression of frustration. But one thing that has been interesting, we have 3 kiddos, 3 disabilities. They're sort of different presentations of their disabilities, but largely 3 pretty similar profiles. And our experience with each kid has been completely different, even within the same school. And again, I think that has to do with sort of presentation of disability at certain times and how our kids are expressing themselves. And I think there's also a large gender component with that as well. And that when girls are dysregulated and being seen to be aggressive, it somehow isn't perceived as big as a threat as it is with our youngest, who's male. And certainly when he gets dysregulated, the whole system around him gets dysregulated, and there's a much more heated response to his escalations, which, as we know, tends to further escalate the escalation.
So,
okay, go ahead, Jackie.
Let's try to formulate my idea to a question for both that we can sort of have the chat. But, Bluesette, you talked about having another parent there to guide you along. And Anna, it's not clear that that's happened for you, but if you were thinking about what advice would you give to parents in approaching school, like, is there sort of one key thing that you might think of in terms of what to do?
Yeah, and thank you for the question. Gosh, if it were only sort of a textbook or a recipe to follow, it largely depends. But yes, I would say there are a few key I guess properties of a very effective interaction and relationship with schools. So in some of my work, we have determined what seems to work well and what doesn't work well. And hands down, a unanimous decision is that if you approach guns a-blazing, that is really not a recipe for success. And so we've had some great discussions around families of being able to channel the passion that they have about their child in very productive ways. That is not to minimize the experience of emotion, don't get me wrong. So having a plan is a really good idea. Having an advocate or another parent, a note taker to go in with you is also seems to be an underlying key of success. Having a peer for your child. So even if they're in kindergarten, having a peer who is around the same age or developmentally the same, doesn't even have to be a neurotypical child. It can be quite a typical child. And I really don't like labels either, but to demonstrate the point, if you can bring someone in that helps familiarize the school team with what you're aiming for, and often having a peer for your child present in the room, you begin to see this child in a whole new light, and people can focus on some very different things when your child and a peer is present. So I would highly recommend that. Another essential piece for us was when my son was able to, he became the chair of the meetings. And a lot of times he needed quite a bit of support to do that, but it was also a reminder to everyone that we are here for this reason and this reason only. If Andrew weren't there, I probably wouldn't be talking to these people. So having Andrew with an agenda, if he was able to read at the time, if he was able to hold up a picture and just say, okay, this is what's on the agenda next, really help bring success to the meeting. I think the last thing I would leave you with is that a parent going into a meeting or approaching a school, whether it's the first time or the 30th time, really having a plan and fairly well thought out of how you want it to go. So envisioning, okay, here's the outcome, but also anticipating to a small degree what's going to happen if this outcome doesn't exist. What's my my escape plan? What's the backup plan? Because often the emotion, in my own experience, would overtake sort of the rest of my brain, and I'd either go fight or flight. So if I had a plan, that was less likely to do that. If I had an advocate or a support person there to kind of hold me accountable to what I wanted that meeting to go like, it was also more successful.
Do you have anything to add, Anna?
Yeah, I think just the piece, and it was largely what Bluesette touched on at the beginning, that's been a real, tried to be a real hallmark of the way that we've approached this, is that partnership piece, and partnering with the school and being able to recognize that not everyone knows the answer. I don't know the answers all the time either. And so how do we together work as a team to make this successful? And I think one of the things our family has really tried to recognize is that if the teacher doesn't have the supports they need, then they can't be successful. If the school doesn't have the supports they need, they can't be successful either. And so part of our role has been, how do we advocate for the school so that they can get, if they need additional supports, if they need additional expertise brought to bear. So trying to acknowledge that we all need to be in this together. And that's worked with varying degrees. To Bluesette's point about emotions sometimes being really difficult. And as I said earlier, like, we've had 3 completely different experiences with our kids. 2 have been largely successful. I mean, vigilance and constant engagement has been part of that. But with our 3rd, we've had some really damaged relationships coming out of that. And so even when we try our best to be kind of partners in this, that is a struggle for sure on both sides, I think. And but that partnership piece and that sense of being a team and being supportive of the school is important.
So I'm just thinking that in order to have that kind of partnership, it certainly helps if you have your school and school system on board. And I'm just wondering, Bluesette, do you think that provincial or district policy played a role in how your school responded to Andrew? Or the other thought that I have is that, I remember from some of Gordon's early work on change in school systems, the reflection on what were referred, and excuse my language, but primitive systems, which were really those systems where they didn't have a lot of infrastructure for special ed, being more open to inclusion. Can you reflect on that? And then, Anna, in Nova Scotia, I know there is a policy that, came into being with a lot of fanfare on inclusion. I'd be curious to hear from you how much of an impact that's had or not. So again, maybe Bluesette first.
Sure. I think at least in Saskatchewan, the school divisions have been fighting for autonomy for a long time. They want to be able to make their own decisions. And so in some ways, that's why some divisions are more successful in inclusion than others. We happen to have a pretty progressive division. Maybe it's our demographic, maybe it's because we're North. I'm not entirely sure, and I wouldn't speculate there. But as an assurance to positively influence our son's education the most we could, so sort of increasing our influence, I became very involved. And not only that, but my husband ran for a board trustee and has been on the school board for the past 9 years, and will finish 3 more years, and then of course we'll be out. But it is sort of a way to say, hey, this is super important. We're going to be involved. We're not telling you what to do and then, wiping our hands of it. We're here for the long haul. And that creates a lot of, I think, foundation for great relationships. Just not throwing it at them. Now, not everybody is able to do that. So I'm not suggesting that's the only thing that creates success, but it does make a bit of a presence. When Mark and I walk into a school team meeting, and I'm the president of a family organization that supports individuals, and he's a board of director, It probably had some influence on the principal, the teacher, the resource teacher, and that was helpful. I think though that even in, let's pretend, a division that does not have great policies around inclusive education, leadership either at the administration level, at the teacher level, at the EA, or assistant level, leadership really does have a direct impact on inclusion in a classroom. So in a sort of suppressed inclusive division, individuals can make a huge difference. So that's the message of hope, is that even if you find your policies are not the greatest, you might not have that kind of support, but you can still do things to impact that child positively.
So here in Nova Scotia, we have recently established an inclusive education policy that is progressive and something that has really, I think, has brought forward a change at a policy level that many advocates, myself included, have been looking for. I think one of the challenges we have found with policy is its translation into practice, and COVID hasn't helped either. So the policy sort of came into being, and its big launch was really supposed to be last September. I'm losing, honestly, I've lost track of time entirely in these days, but the main focus of the policy really didn't get the rollout that we had hoped for or anticipated. And I'm not sure if it is just COVID related, but largely what I have found, either from parents that I'm speaking to or even within the school system, that many people don't even know about it still, and are still trying to understand how does it interact with previously existing policies. And an example of that, we have recently been through a process of appealing a suspension for my youngest, and we've lost the suspension because his behavior did not align with the student code of conduct. And even though that we were able to argue the inclusive education policy should be able to position us to understand that his behavior at that point was a disability related issue, as opposed to a code of conduct. If he could have controlled his behavior at that moment, he would have. And so still just a lot of there's just a disconnect between how those pieces relate to each other. And so the sort of frustrating impact on the ground is that we still have sort of some of those more outdated penalizing approaches that I don't think are helpful. And then on the leadership piece, I mean, that is without a doubt in my mind, the leadership piece is the number one thing that can change in a school. So one of our frustrations, and again, 3 kids, 3 different experiences. So with my daughter, we troubleshooted a whole bunch of really intense situations that we were dealing with. And I have amazing and wonderful kids. They're funny, they're empathetic, they are clever, but when they are frustrated, they can present some significant behavioral challenges. And so we have troubleshot, is that the past tense of that word? Through a number of really major issues, and have been able to do that with success. And for some reasons with our youngest, the system just continued to default to, what are the consequences? He should know better. He's in grade 4. He should understand this differently. And it was really quite jarring to realize the more that we got into kind of a cycle of crisis, the more the system continued to default to exclusionary measures, or the notion somehow that inclusion just doesn't work. And we've had school people look us square in the eye and say, he's too hard and we just can't do that here. So I think that leadership piece is massive. And when you do have those troubleshooting moments, when people can say, I don't know what to do, and how do we figure this out, and be able to feel like it's okay that it didn't go well on Tuesday, because maybe it's going to go better tomorrow, and maybe it's not going to go better tomorrow, but we've got to keep working through that. And if the leadership at school gets, overwhelmed and triggered themselves, they're not able to keep pushing that piece through. And that becomes really damaging to the experience of the teachers, the EAs, the students, and it makes it difficult at a practical level for success.
Let me ask about your communities. Both of you have talked about working with the school system and having support. And I get the impression from Bluesette that she's had and maybe nurtured a significant partnership among other families in order to support inclusion with her son. And I'm not quite sure whether Anna is telling us that she has support in advocacy that's reliable and informed and all that sort of thing at all. But I'd like to hear from both of you about the degree to which, as parents, you have had support from a parent organization or a parent network, and to what extent that's been necessary and helpful or not. Bluesette.
Yeah, I think the reason why I am so involved is that I needed the support myself, and there wasn't a current support system in place. So what better reason than to make one up? And, you know, with another parent, founded our family support organization here in our area. And it is very similar to supports that you might find with Inclusion Saskatchewan or Inclusion Canada. And it's just a small regional version of that. It became very clear early on that even though my son was receiving quite a bit of success in the school system, that was more of an anomaly than not. And so we set up a committee to say, why is that happening? What's going on with this inconsistency? And that's where we determined leadership is very key, but also the cornerstone for success in inclusive education with our kids was communication, either good, effective communication or breakdowns and ineffective communication. And, you know, people are complex. So that is a variable that, you know, when you figure it out, let me know, because it is pretty difficult to navigate. But there are some things that are shown and proven to be more effective. Communication styles, you know, setting up agendas, getting on the same page, all of that. So from our findings, so our Inclusive Education Committee, which was comprised of parents and of members from the school division, because they also wanted to figure out what was going on, we discovered that the inconsistencies were largely due to miscommunication. So we set out to try to figure out how do we improve or enhance the quality of communication between school teams and families, with the common goal of improving the quality of inclusive education for that student or their child. So we created the contract, which was 50% funded by both the family organization and the school division. So it was unbiased, third party, coming in to facilitate communication. Not to say I bring all this expertise, but really just to facilitate. This is what I heard you say. Is that what you meant? This is what, you know, the family wants. This is what the school is communicating, note-taking, all those pieces. And in fact, that has improved people's experience in working with schools. It has improved the school's experience with working with families, and therefore has enhanced the quality of inclusive education. Now, we're going into year 7, so it is a long-term, high energy input effort, but it's fully worth it. And, you know, sometimes I want to pull my hair out.
This is someone dedicated to improving communication between the school and parents.
That's right. So we had to create a contract.
By both sides.
That's right. So there's an existing contract that the school and the family organization PACE, you know, wrote together. It's signed. The contract position is called the Communication Support Associate, and she has a job description, and she is, you know, valued by both families and school teams, and is paid on an hourly rate from year to year.
Okay, Anna, what about support from the parent movement for you?
So I think I've been a bit of an anomaly in the sense as well that I have, given my experiences working on human rights, working in the field, I think the assumption for many of the sort of avenues that we were engaging with, people just assumed I was the advocate and that I was doing this. So I haven't really had a lot of external support. And even for a lot of families who got recommendations to connect with community living or to connect with other kind of partnerships, we never even got those. And I think, again, part of that is because the assumption was, well, she knows what she's doing, and that there, you know, I think that I do have a skill set around that regard. But at the same time, I think because of that skill set, I have not received the types of supports that would be just as helpful, because at the end of the day, despite my advocacy skills and despite my negotiation efforts, I am still a mom who is trying to manage all of these pieces, and to have someone there to help carry that package, I think is really important. But similar, I think, to Bluesette, as you spend time navigating the systems, you get to know other people, usually moms, who are navigating the systems. And so a group of moms and I did initially form a Families for Inclusive Education Nova Scotia, recognizing there really does seem to be a gap right now of information to families about what is available, about how to navigate those systems. And the parent navigator role that exists within our school board or our school structures is largely, it's from the perspective of the Department of Education. And so it's not designed necessarily to help families figure out ways around existing structures. It's simply ways of telling them the existing structures that exist. So we had formed Families for Inclusive Education Nova Scotia. We have started to reach out to families to try and get that level of interest and engagement, because Bluesette, I think you're right, like that committee approach and really working together is critical. I will say we've struggled to get families through the door and for families to stay in the door. There has been sort of a difference in, is this just for kids with intellectual disabilities? Is this for all kids? How do we manage that sort of cross disability approach? And so there's still some quirks and quirks we're working out, but we have recognized, similar to what Bluesette has mentioned, that need for a solid family voice to try and take this forward is important.
I do know a little bit about some of your experiences, Anna, and I would expect that Bluesette would have had some similar ones. When there's been a crisis, what do you think the school should be doing to avert a crisis in the future? And I guess, Bluesette, from your perspective, it's more when there was a challenge, what do you think, as a general comment, that school systems could be doing to approach that in a positive way rather than in a confrontational way?
Well, let's face it, crises happen all the time at school. And, fortunately, I think we've moved on from, not entirely, but mostly moved on from engaging either a sibling of a child and saying, hey, you fix this, or you change the diaper, or whatever the circumstance is, or having a contingency plan in place so that parents aren't called and students being disinvited to their classrooms. Those are pieces that they're all pre-planning and often get missed because they're not in that urgency phase, right? They're very important, but they're not urgent, so they don't get dealt with. So, it's sort of up to the family often to say, this is extremely important, and if we don't do something now, it's going to be urgent, so I'll make it urgent for you in the most diplomatic way possible, is to have these contingency plans so that if something does happen, there's a protocol in place that doesn't involve pulling parents out of a working situation, pulling siblings out of a classroom, or stopping learning from, everyone else. And I don't mean to say that, my child stopped learning for everyone, but that it's part of an everyday routine. People have difficult times. They have meltdowns. Ain't nothing but a thing. We got a plan in place because you're modeling for those students how to interact with an individual who may have some challenging behaviors or a different way of communicating. you're modeling, they're watching you. So we better have a plan.
Yeah. And I think just to echo on that, it would be that proactive approach to supports. How do we stay ahead of the cycle of crisis? Because when we track it, and so part of that is being a detective and knowing where does the crisis come from and how do we get ahead of that and prevent it from happening in the first place. And another piece I think I'd add is a focus on relationships. And the more that we can focus on helping kids feel good about themselves at school, the more we can help establish that foundation of safety. Because once that gets disrupted, that cycle of crisis, I think, begins to perpetuate itself, and the relationships get fragmented, and kids very quickly can tell when people are frustrated with them or don't want to be around them. And very quickly will respond to that. And so building relationships that understand where and how disability presents itself, and that this isn't a personal failure of anyone's, that if they're, if a meltdown has happened, we need to move through that and give teachers and EAs and schools the skills to manage that in ways that don't become disruptive to relationships.
Yeah, so, I mean, if I hear what you've said throughout this conversation that we've had, is there really does need to be support for families. It doesn't matter how much you know or how much you've done for other people, you really need that support and that relationship. And so, I think it comes back to a lot of what we've heard throughout these conversations, and what we know is that the relationships are so important wherever they are, within families, between families, with family and school. And that it sounds that the two of you have worked really hard to make those work for you, and continue to do that, because it is a journey along the way. Thanks.
So with that, Jackie's going to have the last word. Thank you both, Anna and Bluesette, for chatting with us today. And I think both of you have shown your dedication to your children and to inclusion. And I'm sure that parents who participate in this session will find what you've said inspiring and challenging at the same time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.